the forum coordinator for the VTS student body. On behalf of the Social Concerns Committee, co-sponsors of this event, I'd like to welcome you to our forum, Occupy Faith, Leadership for the 100%. Please join me in a word of prayer. O God, your unfailing providence sustains the world we live in and the life we live. Watch over those both night and day who work while others sleep, who work while others wake, but whose work goes unnoticed, who work without fair remuneration, and who do not work at all but are desperate to do so. Grant that we may never forget that our common life depends upon each other's toil. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Before we begin, a couple of thank yous are most certainly in order. We'd like to thank the Dean's Office for helping pay for this event, Benjamin Judd and the Meriwether Godsey staff for preparing the refreshments, Meredith Pilling, Tim Dang, and Curtis Prather for help with facilities, technology, and logistics. We'd, of course, like to thank our distinguished panel, Micah Bales, George Packard, James Cooper, and Barney Hawkins, about all of whom I will say a little bit more in just a moment. Most especially, I'd like to thank Weston Matthews for his faithful and thoughtful work putting this event together. I've helped coordinate, I've learned today, more than 100 forums in the last 2 years, and I can tell you with near certainty that none has received the kind of time and attention from its organizer as this one. And so I'm very grateful to Weston for all of his very hard work. Thanks for bringing us together this evening. As is good and proper, given Jesus' attention to the subject, we'll be talking this evening a lot about money. How we spend it, how we are slaves to it, how we are part of structures that cause so many to go without it, and how we can use it in a sacramental way for the good of God's mission of justice and reconciliation by the grace of Christ. As many of you know, the VTS community is involved in efforts to help rebuild the cathedral in Haiti, to serve as a place for worship and a center for mission in Port-au-Prince. In honor of this event, several individuals and organizations have pledged some money to that very worthy end, and I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Barney Hawkins to tell you a little bit about that.
Thank you, Kyle. It is a deep honor to welcome Micah Bales and George Packard and Jim Cooper to Virginia Theological Seminary, and I think Weston Matthews has already received an applause, but probably the last applause this evening should also be for him and for the careful work he's done in bringing us together and for setting up this rich time for us to chat, to talk, and to learn. But it also was the desire of those planning this to honor the people who are here on the stage and to honor them by making a donation to the cathedral in Haiti, which will be built, hopefully with every one of us helping. So I'm happy to say that $2,800 has been raised and will be sent to Cathedral Haiti to help make that a real possibility. So tonight we give thanks for the participants, but we also know that behind the scenes people have been very generous, honoring and wanting to remain anonymous, honoring the participants and the panel. So we give thanks for that gift for the cathedral in Haiti.
Thank you, Barney. Those monies include anonymous donors, the VTS Social Concerns Committee, and the Dean's Office, correct? So many thanks to all of them. Now a brief word about our panelists. First, the Reverend Dr. James Cooper is the 17th Rector of historic Trinity Wall Street. Along with staff and lay leadership, Father Cooper is responsible for Trinity's life and ministry from worship to real estate to faith formation to mission partnerships throughout the Anglican Communion and to efforts to tell the story of Trinity as a parish to the world. Father Cooper received his bachelor's degree from Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, and his Master of Divinity degree and Doctor of Divinity degree at Virginia Theological Seminary. After seminary at VTS, he worked in New York from 1970 to 1972, appointed assistant rector to St. Peter's Church in Albany. In 1972, he began as rector of Christ Episcopal Church in Ponte Vedra, Florida, where he began with a Sunday congregation of about 75 members. Under Father Cooper's leadership, Christ Church experienced tremendous growth as a vital parish and is now one of the largest Episcopal churches in the United States. In Florida, Father Cooper also funded 2 not-for-profit life care facilities, Vickers Landing and Glenmore, and also helped to establish a congregation in Pontevedra's sister city in Pontevedra, Spain. Bishop George Packard received the Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars for his service with the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam. After graduation from Virginia Theological Seminary in 1974, he transferred his commission from the infantry to the reserves as a chaplain. Bishop Packard was assistant rector of St. Paul's Church, Lynchburg, Virginia, rector of Christ Church in Martinsville, Virginia, and rector of Grace Church, Hastings-on-Hudson in New York. Based on his inner-city experience as director of a social service agency in the Bronx, he completed a thesis for an STM degree, coursework in psychiatry and religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Bishop Packard's experience as a soldier, combined with his pastoral and organizational abilities, prompted the Army to direct his assignments from installation chaplain to hospital chaplain to an operational unit to teaching at the Army Chaplain School to the mobilization of a field army in Egypt and ultimately to the Pentagon during Desert Storm. After retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1996, Bishop Packard was consecrated as the Episcopal Church's 5th bishop suffragan for federal ministries in 2000 and was succeeded by Bishop J. Magnus in 2010. In retirement, Bishop Packard and his wife Brooke have been occupied by the Holy Spirit, ministering with women and men from many backgrounds who believe that mainstream religion must radically defy the unspoken, hierarchical societal order in which tradition and well-meaning acts of trickle-down charity do little to expose and challenge the reproduction of inequality. Micah Bales is a graduate of Earlham School of Religion and is a leader of Occupy Church, D.C. He is a member of the Rockingham Friends Meeting and is an active participant in gospel labor throughout the United States and abroad. Micah lives in Washington, D.C., where he is active with Capitol Hill Friends and works for Earlham School of Religion. For more information about Micah's ministry, please visit his blog at lambswar.blogspot.com. And finally, the Reverend Dr. J. Barney Hawkins IV currently serves as Vice President for Institutional Advancement, Associate Dean for the Center of Anglican Communion Studies, and Professor of Pastoral Theology at VTS. A graduate of Furman and Duke Universities, Dr. Hawkins has served on the boards of Episcopal Reef and Development and Canuga Conferences Incorporated. Presently, he serves as treasurer on the North American Regional Committee of St. George's College, Jerusalem. And over the past several years, Dr. Hawkins has played an instrumental role in the quiet and public phases of the capital campaign for the Chapel of the Ages at VTS. Dr. Hawkins is an honorary associate at Emmanuel Church on the Hill here in Alexandria, Virginia. So that is most of my words of introduction. I've probably said too much already, but before we begin our conversation, let me just describe to you a little bit about how it will work. This is a moderated conversation, not a debate, and we are gathered here as part of the body of Christ. I request and expect that the panelists and members of the audience will afford each other the respect we pledge to one another in baptism and that is due to creatures formed in the image of God. In the first part of our time together, I will rotate through and ask each of our panelists 2 questions. We'll rotate, we'll do one round and then a second round. And I'll try to give you a little signal at 4 minutes and would ask you to try not to go over 5. Less than that is fine. Bishop Packard, I see you glaring. I'm very sorry that the light has worked out in that way.
Working on my tan.
Yeah. My hope is that the sun will be kinder as the evening goes on. Sorry, I lost my place. If there's time before our break at approximately 6 o'clock, I have some more general questions of a theological bent that I will offer to the group as a whole, and to which any panelists may respond. We'll take a very short break, 5 minutes or so, at about 6 o'clock, and then we'll reconvene for questions from the audience. I'll come around with the microphone, and we'll do that. And we'll end in time for you to follow up individually with the panelists as they are willing and able, and hopefully that will give everyone enough time to get where they need to be, including seniors over to Dean Markham's house. I will leave you then with some words from Anglican thinker and Christian socialist F.D. Morris that I have always found helpful in these kinds of contentious discussions. Morris writes, "The acknowledgement of a God who beareth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things, who has been long-suffering with all his creatures and long-suffering with us. This knowledge will make us tremble to deal harshly with the struggles and doubts, how much more with the convictions of our fellow human beings." The grammar of that rather long sentence will hold up to your scrutiny if you Google it and read it, I promise. As for the theology, we shall have to trust each other. So with that, I'm going to open things up for questions. And my first question is for Father Cooper. Recent events, including Trinity Wall Street and St. Paul's London's friction with neighboring Occupy movement encampments, as well as accusations that mainline churches responded too slowly to the Trayvon Martin tragedy, highlight the challenges of discerning faithful and timely Christian engagement with pressing community issues. The immediacy of the 24-hour news cycle and the growing importance of social media increase the pressure on congregational leaders to help provide witness within these conversations. Through your engagement with the Occupy movement, what factors have you considered in making decisions about how to proceed? And how did you incorporate the perspectives of the various and many parish, diocesan, and community stakeholders whose opinions you are responsible to?
That question's a little longer than the introduction than most of my papers at Virginia Seminary. I'd like to start with a preamble that certainly there are congregations that respond too slowly to the immediacy of social events or political events. The disastrous killing in Florida, having lived in Florida with Traynor, we addressed that Sunday. We wore hoods, had classes on stand your ground, and rather than, and put a perspective forward of stand down. The focus was on anti-gun legislation, that in that circumstance no one should have had a gun. And so some churches do respond immediately and quickly. On the economic issue, Trinity has been in conversation about the current crisis since just the early days of the subprime debacle, and partnered with Jesse Jackson, the Rainbow Coalition, in conferences addressing that. Sat with Martin Grunberg, who at the time was the vice chair of FDIC, now is the chair, and engaged in conversation at a high level in a big room like this, filled with people, to raise the issue. When we get to Occupy Wall Street, I think that's the greatest strength of the movement, to have given voice to the issue. There's criticism that there's not direction yet. I think that's unfair. That any discussion needs to begin with the prophetic voice and perhaps hearing uncomfortable things from all sides. Trinity then proceeded to invite Rowan Williams, who's obviously a theologian, but has a great background in economics, to our Trinity Institute and engaged the conversation at that point, both theologically and from a market-based perspective. Then another conference with John Rogers, Executive Vice President of Goldman Sachs, followed by one with Faith, Morality, and the Marketplace with Jay Collins, the Global Head of Citibank. I mention that because I've been on several panels like this and listened to them on the radio and seen them on peep clips on YouTube, and rarely will you see the head of one of the major corporations being willing to expose himself or herself to this kind of a program. Try to invite and see what happens, and it's usually a no. Trinity has responded. We're not a bank, we're not a financial institution, we're a well-resourced parish, and become, in sessions like this, the lightning rod for the entire economy, all of the banking system and financials. Who else do you have to talk with? That'll come to the room and sit here and be engaged. So Trinity was early on into the situation because it was a crisis, and it was obvious. Trinity is aligned with the themes of Occupy Wall Street, and has been for a decade or so. However, not in lockstep with a few tactics. I think in many cities there are former tactics. We'll yet to see come May 1st whether it's a continuing tactic in New York City, and that's the controversy over occupying private property and how you move through a conversation about that. And perhaps there's a time later in the program that would come up. So you start by discerning what in the world God is trying to accomplish, rather than who am I, what am I called to do. I think it begins with a collective discernment process for a parish community and our partners to discern what perhaps might God be wanting to accomplish in this world, and then to discern what particular tools we have, and we do not have all of them. Okay, sorry, you didn't give me the cue on the time.
No, that's the
together.
4.
That's what?
That's the 4. Sorry, keep going.
That's the what?
That's the 4 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry.
So we're concluding.
You've got another minute.
You got another minute. Okay. So once a theological look at what God's accomplishing in the world, and then a discernment of what particular skills can you bring to that. You can't bring all of them, and then to deploy them. So that was what we've been about at Trinity for 8 to 10 years, to address the issues related to economic policies. But it's not the only policy. We've had the responsibility with others of working on the relationships of the Episcopal Church in the Anglican Communion, equity in marriage equity, particularly in the state of New York, continuing race issues, and the like, plus being a parish with acolytes, Sunday schools, and so forth. Thanks.
Thank you, Father Cooper. It's helpful. I think one of the challenges in processing these sort of big name events is getting that bigger picture of the things that are going on that's not in the papers. And so I appreciate your filling out our understanding of the ways that Trinity has engaged this. My second question is for Micah. This one's a little shorter. Marissa Egerstrom, Episcopal protest chaplain and PhD candidate in American religious history at Harvard, has called the Occupy movement the most liturgical protest in American history. As an emerging faith leader, what about the Occupy movement called you to participate in the movement's public sign acts? For instance, your delivery of a golden calf to Congress.
Well, first of all, let me thank you all for having me here today as an outsider to the Episcopal Church, bringing my own perspective as a friend. I found the question interesting, talking about the liturgy of the Occupy movement, and for me as a Quaker, the word liturgy hadn't occurred to me. Those aren't Quakers don't have a spoken liturgy, and we don't tend to think in liturgical terms. But I definitely see the truth of it. In reference to the golden calf, as a Quaker, the golden calf was for me a prophetic sign, and that's something that's much more within the Quaker tradition of. In very bold ways, the early Quaker movement did prophetic signs. We went naked in the streets. We walked around with burning coals on our head. We did all kinds of really dramatic and crazy things to draw attention to God's judgment on a fallen culture and calling the culture back to right relationship with God. And so, for me in the Occupy movement, I feel like I'm standing in that prophetic tradition. And the Occupy movement isn't something that I had on my radar screen before it started at all. In fact, I had broad concerns about social justice and peace, but I did not think of myself as an organizer or an activist. I was just busy doing my job for the seminary I worked for and helping to plant a church on Capitol Hill. But as I learned more about the Occupy movement, I became increasingly convinced that God wanted me to be involved in this movement. I didn't know exactly what God was doing. I didn't understand exactly what was going on. I think like a lot of people, I was like, well, what's their demand? But I felt like God was calling me to get involved. And so I went up to New York City and got involved in Occupy Wall Street for a little while, came back to Washington, D.C., and ended up being one of the original organizers for Occupy D.C. In McPherson Square. And since then, it's just sort of resonated out from that encampment to where now there are dozens of different organizations that have sprouted as a result of that initial explosion. And I'm especially involved in, as you mentioned, Occupy Church, which is a specifically Christian Occupy movement, Occupy Faith, which is interfaith, and Occupy Homes, which is involved in foreclosure resistance. I think what's important for me to remember in the Occupy movement is that my allegiance isn't to a particular party or to a particular political ideology, but instead I and other Christian occupiers are trying to walk in Jesus' way that He's leading us in right now, and being attentive to how the Holy Spirit is guiding us. And there have been so many times when I've wanted to walk away, and there have been things that have happened that I didn't like, and things have not always gone the way that I expected. But I've continually felt God calling me back into this movement, into involvement, and commitment to the people who are involved in it, who whether they're Christians or not, whether they're people of faith or not, I believe that they feel the call of the Holy Spirit in their lives, and that they are being pulled into a more faithful way of living. And I want to be involved in that, and involved in empowering ordinary people who never thought that they would be involved in this kind of stuff before, because I didn't think I was going to be involved in this. But empowering ordinary people to get involved in a grassroots movement to promote justice and a society in which our economic values are more closely aligned with what I believe God's values are.
Thank you. That's right. Thank you. There we go. That's helpful, and I was struck. Several of us have visited encampments at various times, and have been struck by that it's normal people involved in this act together. So I appreciate that. Thank you. My next question is for Bishop Packard, who I think can maybe see me down there. Since their inceptions, the Church of England and Anglican Communion have been largely establishment traditions, with theologians such as Richard Hooker showing an obvious interest in maintaining the social order. Your criticism of Trinity Church and your actions on December 17th at Trinity's Duarte Park seem to center on what you call mainstream religion's unsaid contract with a societal order which keeps wheels turning and so many disenfranchised. Tell us about your experience as a bishop of the Episcopal Church, climbing that property line fence in purple cassock and being arrested. How did this act of civil disobedience reflect your critique of this contract with the social order?
Can you hear me? Good. By the way, the wait staff should continue to move with libation here. A well lubricated I, along with Jim, have been speaking to lots of groups, and this is potentially going to be a lot of fun. I can see. I'm so nerdy. I answered all of the questions, even not my own. So let me read some of the things that I wrote down because I tend to forget details, and then I'll extemporate a little bit too. To be clear, invoking Richard Hooker is to invoke the Principal Skinner of Anglican Divines here from The Simpsons. The questioner didn't use, with all due respect, didn't use F.D. Morris or William Temple or Michael Ramsey. So I feel a little bit like the deck is stacked when there's that reference. So where to start? Given Hooker's defense of human laws written because, quote, of the wild beast nature of man, I would find it difficult to find a good reference in him, a man so steeped in questions of authority in the Elizabethan era. He certainly wouldn't be pleased with my arrest, mind you. No, and he goes on, in defense of Hooker, no one ought to be hurt or injured by another, he says. He does open with this also. He says, quote, the law is commendable and is directed to the goodness of operation, end quote. And what if the operation, and I echo Micah here, what if the operation is bereft of that goodness? Also, my experience with the populations and disaster recoveries in September 11th, you didn't put in there in that bio that I was the canon of the ordinary in New York City. And so I know something about New York beyond it being New York. It's my home. And so when that happened, that body blow happened, I happened to be the bishop of the armed forces. My home diocese was immobilized. The only way to get into the perimeter was through St. Paul's Chapel. And so I know something about disaster. And then Charles Jenkins asked me to do some of the same stuff after Katrina. So my experiences with populations and disaster recoveries after those events, 9/11 or Katrina, puts me more in the camp of Rebecca Solnit, who chronicles the craven aspect of humanity is not craven, it's nobility. People respond out of the generosity of how they've been created, and there's a blessedness in how they've been created, and they respond that way. But it's, in all due respect to your question, I don't want to be beating up too much here, it's Augustine really who encouraged cooperation with civil authorities, and we can trace back to Constantine, when the persecuted church nearly overnight had a vested interest in the Roman Empire's successful flourishing. In my homily today, I referred to Walter Wink's book, Engaging the Powers, Unmasking the Powers, Naming the Powers. Are you familiar with these books? These are books you should read. They're timely and appropriate. When he described the domination system as the vehicle for progress for civilization through the years, he's not indicting our culture, just as Hooker would acknowledge God's use of the created. The created is also potentially frail and fallen, and as institutions for humanity, they can be that way, but they can also function and thrive. So God uses them in spite of their fallenness. No, the problem is the awareness of this system has of itself. In Hooker's day, there was a continual reference to God and the created order. It moderated force and power. It was that way the world was known. You might say there was a balance, and the institutions created by God had a connection with the whole as described by the church. That was the air that was breathed. There was no quarrel with an institution's interdependence and even its incompleteness. Indeed, there were created yet broken vessels, always in need of redemption. Redemption from what? Well, from the direction of self-sufficiency. That's the problem, this self-sufficiency as an end in itself. Jim's already mentioned, you probably couldn't get a CEO from one of the major corporations to a group in a conversation like this.
Bishop, we're past 4 minutes, just so you know.
Okay. Can I borrow extra time? Put $20 on the table here. I'll have a couple of quick things here. Okay. The courtesy of Citizens United, even those disembodied entities now have voices. You all know this. So frankly, this part of the naivete of this forum's theme, with all due respect, of ministry to the 100%, in order for ministry to even be considered like this, the dominant 1% would have to be aware of its unequal position of dominance and avarice. Moreover, 100% declaration sort of whizzes by the fallenness and sin that's inherent here. This quaint way of describing it has all the atmosphere of what one occupier once said to me, of having sherry to discuss social justice, but never getting around to doing anything about it. But back to the social order and the church's acknowledgement of its necessity. I think I'm going to pause there, because I do respect to your time frame and make reference to some of these other things. I'll just say this: many writers, Ross Douthat, a conservative writer, Carney Ross, Walter Wink, Chris Hedges, they all believe that the breakdown has occurred, and it's paramount for our conversation here that the church has in some senses colluded in this system, and I'm trying to seek some sort of awareness of this, and this is the breakdown of the conversation, even between Jim and me. We can't crack that nut.
Thank you, Bishop. I just wanted to add that I have not heard Rebecca Solman's name since I got to seminary, but I'm very grateful to hear it. So, thank you. Okay, first question for Dr. Hawkins. VTS is an institution that depends upon a network of generous donors for operating budget, scholarship support, and most recently, the substantial Chapel for the Ages capital campaign. Many students choose to study here specifically because the school is in a position to help them graduate free of educational debt. As the Vice President for Institutional Advancement, how have you maintained and developed these relationships at a time when church budgets are tight? What fundraising and asset management advice do you have for leaders of churches and related nonprofits, and for balancing among the various funding priorities that support the church's mission?
Thank you, Kyle. I'll begin by saying that VTS is part of the 1%, and we'll get to that later. VTS is committed because of its resources to helping our students graduate free of educational debt, or at least additional educational debt. And this requires a network of generous donors, past and present, and we're constantly monitoring how we stay connected because it is crucial to our mission. In the past 12 years, I have watched the student body get younger and younger as I've gotten older and older. It's a trend that we must encourage, at least the first part of that trend. It means, however, that students often bring with them to seminary troublesome educational and credit card debt. Part of our endowment is designated for scholarships. As church budgets have tightened, and they certainly have, we've seen our annual fund under stress. This is particularly true this year. However, the annual fund does not augment our scholarships and help people to graduate debt-free. The annual fund supplements the operating funds of the seminary. So what about the money for scholarships? How much money do we have each year for scholarships? In scholarships, need-based grants, and housing subsidies, we will expend in FY 2012 $2,262,000. We also have scholarships for Black Episcopalians. The Bishop Payne Scholarship is active, but it is only for full and part-time tuition for Black Episcopalians. The average scholarship package at Virginia Seminary is a maximum grant of $27,000. Additional housing subsidies can be as much as $1,050 a month. So debt-free education is something we aim for, but it is important to say this is hard. Last year there were about a dozen students who ended up with new debt. Also, a majority of students now pay their bills with their credit cards, so we do not really have an idea of how much new debt they really are taking on. Now, the second question was about fundraising and asset management and what advice we might have to leaders of churches and related nonprofits. Let me first address asset management advice. VTS, in good times and in bad, lives within its budget. We are fiscally conservative. It's been part of our tradition. We do not spend money we do not have. The Board of Trustees has set a 4.5% draw on our endowment, or at least we should not exceed that. But because of current returns in the marketplace, there are some who think we should actually reduce the draw. Some institutions have reduced their draw to 3%. This would have an impact on our operating budget and on our scholarships. We manage our assets as trustees, stewards of the seminary's ministry and mission, but also mindful that we will bequeath this institution strong and financially secure to those who will come after us. We cannot do anything else but that. We've been blessed with good leadership, and the dean and the current board of trustees are building on strength for a future which will be strong. So we are, in a sense, living now, but also living for the future. The December endowment for the seminary was $128 million. Our part in the Letty Pate Evans Foundation Fund is valued at $215 million. Now, against that backdrop, let me speak a little about fundraising. And then I'll stop. I'll get back to it later.
No, I mean, you got a minute.
Do I have a minute?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm sure you 4 minutes.
Some people said that it's difficult to raise money when you have money. This is not true. We have made a clear and compelling case with our capital campaign. We need a chapel. We have 1,200 donors who have stepped up. Philanthropy is different from charitable giving. People give to VTS not because we are a charity which needs money, but rather because we are an institution which has a viable future, and because we matter for the future of the Episcopal Church and for the Anglican Communion. VTS keeps addressing viability, in other words, vision and purpose, but we also constantly address sustainability. We live with a strategic plan, and we're constantly asking questions about institutional effectiveness, even as we ask questions about how we should participate and occupy Wall Street and other movements. We live in a culture of assessment and planning. I think that's the best thing we could say to leaders of churches and nonprofits. Ministry and mission are always tied to vision and resources. We all know that the future belongs to God, but what we do now really does matter. And we must live for those who will come after us, even if it means sometimes appearing less prophetic or faithful. I think it's an awesome tension and an unbelievable responsibility.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm going to pull an audible here and ask the panel what you'd like to do. I'd like to take a short break to let everyone stretch their legs in about 10 minutes. We could do the second round of questions and be a little bit briefer, or we can, and I think that maybe this would be a good option if you're all interested, just basically give everyone some more time to make some comments before we open up for questions. So I'm open to any of those things. Do you have a preference? Okay.
I think I'm really interested in the questions rather than hearing us too much.
Okay. Well, why don't we do this then? Why don't we go back through? I'll ask the second round of questions, and if people want to, answer them directly, wonderful. If you'd like to go a little further afield, so be it. So we'll go back through, and we'll try to keep things a little bit briefer. I am mindful that this is a long time to sit, and so we'll go from there. So back to Father Cooper. Trinity Wall Street has a strong record of commitment to Anglican Communion partnerships, and according to its website, gave nearly $1 million in 2011 to missional projects in Africa alone. As a parish with a unique history and position of wealth and influence within the Anglican Communion, how does Trinity Church put together its budget? How does the church balance outreach programs like Trinity Grants with competing spending priorities?
You have 2 minutes.
We put our budget together carefully based upon a projection of anticipated income, mostly from our real estate portfolio, and to create that in a sustainable way. It's been there for 314 years, intends to be there for much longer, until the second coming. And this is Virginia. That was a bit of a joke, sorry. And, you know, the parousia. In order to do that, you cannot spend more than you can afford. And many churches in New York have done that, and they're on their way out. The trend amongst some of the more modern foundations is like Gates and others that want to spend them down, and there's value in that. You create something that has a life in and of itself. But our budget is based upon a percentage of income, not a percentage of total net income, and all that exceeds the cost of running the real estate portfolio is used for ministry.
Thank you. Micah, second question for you. Occupy Church DC has chosen foreclosure resistance as a point of focus for helping working families stay in their homes and shining a light on corporatism and what you call America's downward spiral of wealth worship. Can you tell us about this work and how your background as a Quaker, if you think this is relevant, and as a faith leader has helped to shape that work?
Well, one thing that my background as a Quaker is shaping is my incredulity that you think this is a long time to sit. I know you do a lot of standing up and sitting down. And kneeling. We sit for long periods of time. I'm involved with Occupy Homes DC, which is a part of a broader movement to resist unjust foreclosure and eviction, and just generally to keep people in their homes, because we have a housing situation right now where we've got hundreds of thousands of homes, maybe millions of homes that there's no one in them, there's no one occupying them, and there are people out on the street that are a lot of people like living in hotels because they've been thrown out of their homes, and on the other side of that, you've got banks who are reaping enormous profits while they're going through this foreclosure process in ways that are outright illegal in many, many cases, perhaps most cases. And that's really what we've been discovering in Occupy Our Homes, is that we have a lot easier time actually doing resistance of eviction and foreclosure because the banks are well aware that what they're doing in many cases is illegal. And so all we have to do is shine a flashlight on it, and suddenly, we did 2 days of demonstrations at Freddie Mac at their downtown offices and at their offices out in Tyson's Corner. And within 2 days, they and Bank of America were calling up the homeowner that they were about to throw out of her house and saying, no, don't worry, we can work this out. I think the magnitude of the corruption and illegal behavior that's going on, not to mention injustice, but simply stuff that's illegal, is beyond what most people imagine it is. And as a disciple of Jesus Christ, my motivation or at least a big part of my motivation for doing this work is that I read again and again in the Hebrew Scriptures that the land doesn't belong to us. that actually we are tenants in the land, and the Lord is our landlord. The Lord is our landlord, and we owe an account to God for how we treat the land, how we treat the people who live on the land, and how resources are apportioned up. So my view, which I believe is scriptural, is that we need to be really careful about strict ideas of ownership and propriety, because ultimately everything belongs to the Lord, and we are accountable to Him.
Thank you very much, Micah. Bishop Packard, a second question for you. Before you went to seminary, you were a decorated soldier in Vietnam. Throughout your ministry, you have been a leader in providing care for the vulnerable, including veterans and inner-city social service clients. How has your formation as a priest and bishop, including your time at VTS, helped you to develop your pastoral sensitivity and capacity for priestly leadership in these contexts? In what sense have these experiences been continuous or discontinuous with your involvement in the Occupy movement?
Well, I walking in here, I saw Albert Molligen's portrait up there at the end of the hall, and Jesse Trotter's picture here. These are people who formed me, and I was privileged, I guess, or not, to face the theodicy question while I was here. What's the problem of evil on a very personal level in my family? And I give God thanks for having to face that. And so formation is a continuing process. It doesn't kind of happen, sort of like this. In my marriage, my wife being married to Brooke, sitting right over here, who got beaten up on December 17th, who's been arrested at a foreclosure. My maddening daughter in college, who I love to pieces, forms me. You mentioned what I was wearing. I didn't kind of pull some duds out of the closet that I thought would be kind of neat to wear. I mean, I wore those clothes when I was visiting a morgue in Bosnia, when I celebrated the Eucharist at Saddam's palace in Iraq, when I visited, returning veterans at Brooke Army Hospital or at Walter Reed. So, formation and discernment is kind of a evolving thing. And my friends, you must realize that we're on the edge of something really quite unusual. I won't use the word spectacular, because I don't know what it's going to be. This is a life-changing horizontal movement, and you'll see it all over the place. It doesn't necessarily have the label of Occupy on it, but it is redefining who we are. Hierarchies are understandably in place, but we don't bestow upon them the power that they once had. We are removing the power from them. And Occupy, this is the problem when I try to talk to friends who are in the institution with me. I say the only thing we have, as I mentioned in the homily today, the only thing we have is our bodies. This is what Mike is referring to. When you go to a foreclosure, you have your body. You don't have a vote. You don't have any say. You don't have any credit, really. You think you've got credit? Okay, you've got credit sort of limitedly. The only thing you have is your body, and your body can be committed to an environment, and that is your voice. And that's why it is essential for us to have encampments in the Occupy movement. It is essential that we remain nonviolent. My friend Chris Hedges has an entire worry, a very deep worry. I was on the phone with him for 2 nights last week. We were talking about the Black Bloc movement. If they take over the Occupy movement, we have trouble. We are avowedly not violent. But when we place ourselves in private, quote-unquote, property, we are trying to make a statement about whose property really is that. And I wanted to just read this one thing. It's okay. I mean, we're not in the Occupy movement kind of bouncing around like bumper cars, kind of, this is what we think, this is what we think. I mean, there are people who are really committed to this. We have an Occupy think tank in New York. We've got another one in Washington, D.C. At the Left Forum, we gathered and tried to talk this out. We have a salon group of theologians trying to work on matters that affect this Christian anthropology that's developing. You're going to be actors and agents in that. I'll be long gone, and it's going to be your church, and it's going to be horizontally described. It may have a hierarchy, but it's not going to have the same feel and smack. Believe me. And they wanted me to read this into the record. I think it's interesting. Often Trinity's defenders phrase their defense of their space as defense of the church's private property. We think, however, that Occupy is challenging, mostly implicitly, the assumption that one can speak of private property of a church in the same way one uses that phrase more generally in Western society. It's similar to, though of course not the same as, the theological and legal challenge that those who occupy Catholic churches that are slated for closing make about who owns the church property. At the risk of sacrificing nuance and for the sake of brevity, let us be succinct. We think that a very large theological matter before us when Occupy, through its religious leader allies, is saying to Trinity Wall Street or anybody else, we in Occupy, as a multi-faith, interreligious, spiritually pluralistic movement that is also equally non-religious and secular movement, can better meet your mission as a Christian church in this particular time, in this particular place, with negligible negative financial impact and with a rare and time-sensitive influence by using this particular private property to host the next stage of Occupy Wall Street. Let's meet and talk about the liability issues and other concerns you might have. Let's have that dialogue, starting immediately. But in principle, we've had substantial theological point worthy of your consideration. See, that's what's going on here. I mean, that's the meat and potatoes up here at the dais. We're really kind of, we're in control of it. This is we have the power. We have been given this by God's grace, and we are going to harvest these rents and use them for charitable purposes. And Occupy is presenting this very simple question. Why?
Father Cooper, I'd like, if you'd like, I think it's fair to give you an opportunity to answer that if you care to.
Well, if somebody occupies your home, they become the owner. So it's still about ownership. And Trinity Church is a church and not a business corporation. And the use of its set-aside sacred areas are more in line with what the bishop was talking about. But our real estate portfolio is more in line with any other type investment portfolio that, if invaded, creates a situation in which the church is not able to carry out its mission. Our mission, in terms of the themes of Occupy Wall Street, are aligned. In terms of who controls a given piece of property in the city of New York is a healthy debate.
Thank you very much. Barney, I've got one more question.
Can I ask a question in response to that?
Why don't we
save it till after
we'll
have
great.
a couple of glasses of wine and then I'll ask the question.
That can only go well. Okay, so let's let Barney have the last word from this section. Although there are not enough, getting at what you said earlier, there are not enough Episcopal seminaries for there to be a well-identified 1% among them mathematically. The relative wealth and financial security of VTS is notable in a time when theological education, as it has been traditionally practiced, is in jeopardy in our church and across the main line. What is the responsibility of VTS to the church and to our sister schools in this context? How do we avoid the spiritual and missional dangers of zero-sum thinking and practice generous and responsible stewardship of the gifts we have been given? I think you've spoken to some of this already.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. The wealth and financial security of VTS does put it in a category by itself in the universe of Episcopal seminaries. It's clear we have a responsibility to the church and it's a responsibility to educate and form leaders for congregations, strong leaders who will make a difference and who will be able to stand in the public square and do exactly what some of our distinguished alums are doing tonight. We do not feel we have a responsibility to our sister seminaries in the sense that we, in a sense, have a core identity and purpose. And our vocation is to honor the donors who've given to us in the past, and also to do with our endowment what we must do to achieve our first and primary purpose. And actually, Micah Bales was very helpful in talking about much as the land does not belong to us, and how we use it becomes important. And I think in a real sense, we don't believe the endowments we have here at Virginia Seminary belong to us. In a sense, they belong to the larger purpose of this place, and our donors have been rather specific. So it is true that the Episcopal Church needs to take responsibility for its theological education, but Virginia Seminary cannot be responsible for the whole of theological education in the Episcopal Church. The question about zero-sum thinking and all of this, I didn't quite like the premise of it, and I don't quite agree with it, but I will say that I think Virginia Seminary has practiced generous and responsible stewardship with its gifts. Since the middle of the 19th century, we've had international students here. We care deeply about theological education in the Anglican Communion, and while we perhaps don't feel like we have financial responsibility for the other seminaries, in the weak universe which represents the Episcopal seminaries of our church, we do care about places like Holy Cross in Yangon, Myanmar, St. George's College in Jerusalem, Msalada Theological College in Dodoma, Tanzania. So there is a real sense in which, and with our campaign, we are committing to give a tithe to help with the cathedral in Haiti. We're also concerned about Msalada with the campaign, and we're also beginning conversations to raise $1 million to endow Msalada Theological College in Tanzania. So there is a sense in which we're trying to be responsible stewards, but we also cannot take on all the seminaries of the Episcopal Church. And in a sense, our endowments and the donors that gave the money did not envision that, so we must honor that original intention.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, we're going to take a little break. We are going to reconvene in about 5 minutes. I'll shout at you, and we will have some questions from the floor. Thank you.